Section 6. Manufacturing, importing, and possession of instruments or implements intended for the commission of falsification. Article 176. Manufacturing and possession of instruments or implements for falsification. The penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods and a fine not to exceed 1 million pesos shall be imposed upon any person who shall make or introduce into the Philippines any stamps, dies, marks, or other instruments or implements intended to be used in the commission of the offenses of counterfeiting or falsification mentioned in the preceding sections of this chapter. Any person who, with the intention of using them, shall have in his possession any of the instruments or implements mentioned in the preceding paragraph shall suffer the penalty next lower in degree than that provided therein. Chapter 2. Other falsifications. Section 1. Usurpation of authority, rank, title, and improper use of names, uniforms, and insignia. Article 177. Usurpation of authority or official functions. Any person who shall knowingly and falsely represent himself to be an officer, agent, or representative of any department or agency of the Philippine government or of any foreign government, or who, under pretense of official position, shall perform any act pertaining to any person in authority or public officer of the Philippine government or any foreign government or any agency thereof without being lawfully entitled to do so, shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods. Article 178. Using fictitious name and concealing true name. The penalty of arresto mayor and a fine not to exceed 100,000 shall be imposed upon any person who shall publicly use a fictitious name for the purpose of concealing a crime, evading the execution of a judgment, or causing damage. Any person who conceals his true name and other personal circumstances shall be punished by arresto minor or a fine not to exceed 40,000. Article 179. Illegal use of uniforms or insignia. The penalty of arresto mayor shall be imposed upon any person who shall publicly and improperly make use of insignia, uniforms, or dress pertaining to an office not held by such person or to a class of persons of which he is not a member. Section 2. False testimony. Article 180. False testimony against a defendant. Any person who shall give false testimony against the defendant in any criminal case shall suffer 1. The penalty of reclusion temporal if the defendant in said case shall have been sentenced to death. 2. The penalty of prison mayor if the defendant shall have been sentenced to reclusion temporal or reclusion perpetua. The penalty of prison correctional if the defendant shall have been sentenced to any other afflictive penalty. And the penalty of arresto mayor if the defendant shall have been sentenced to a correctional penalty or a fine or shall have been acquitted. In cases provided in subdivisions 3 and 4 of this article, the offender shall further suffer a fine not to exceed 200,000 pesos. Article 181. False testimony favorable to the defendant. Any person who shall give false testimony in favor of the defendant in a criminal case shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor in its maximum period, of prison correctional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 200,000 if the prosecution is for a felony punishable by an afflictive penalty, and the penalty of arresto mayor in any other case. Article 182. False testimony in civil cases. A person found guilty of false testimony in a civil case shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its minimum period and a fine not to exceed 1,200,000 if the amount in controversy shall exceed 1 million, and the penalty of arresto mayor in its maximum period to prisión correccional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 200,000 if the amount in controversy shall not exceed said amount or cannot be estimated. Article 183, false testimony in other cases, and perjury in solemn affirmation. The penalty of prisión mayor in its minimum period to prisión mayor in its medium period shall be imposed upon any person who knowingly makes untruthful statements and, not being included in the provisions of the next preceding articles, shall testify under oath or make an affidavit upon any material matter before a competent person authorized to administer an oath in cases in which the law so requires. Any person who, in case of solemn affirmation made in lieu of an oath, shall commit any of the falsehoods mentioned in this and the three preceding articles in this section shall suffer the respective penalties provided therein, provided that if the person responsible for the commission of this felony is a public officer or employee, the penalty shall be imposed in its maximum period. Provided finally that the offender shall also suffer a fine not to exceed 1 million pesos and perpetual absolute disqualification from holding any appointive or elective position in the government or in any agency, entity, or instrumentality thereof. Article 184, offering false testimony in evidence. Any person who shall willfully and knowingly offer in evidence a false witness or testimony in any judicial or official proceeding shall be punished as guilty of false testimony and shall suffer the respective penalties provided in this section. Chapter 3, Frauds. Section 1, Machinations, Monopolies, and Combinations. Article 185, Machinations in public auctions. Any person who shall solicit any gift or promise as a consideration of refraining from taking part in any public auction, and any person who shall attempt to cause bidders to stay away from an auction by threats, gifts, promises, or any other artifice with intent to cause the reduction of the price of the thing auctioned, shall suffer the penalty of prisión correccional in its minimum period and a fine ranging from 10 to 50% of the value of the thing auctioned. Article 186, Monopolies and Combination in Restraint of Trade. The penalty of prisión correccional in its minimum period or a fine ranging from 200 to 6,000 pesos or both shall be imposed upon 1. Any person who shall enter into any contract or agreement or shall take part in any conspiracy or combination in the form of a trust or otherwise in restraint of trade or commerce, or to prevent by artificial means free competition in the market. 2. Any person who shall monopolize any merchandise or object of trade or commerce, or shall combine with any other person or persons to monopolize and said merchandise or object in order to alter the price thereof by spreading false rumors or making use of any other artifice to restrain free competition in the market. 3. Any person who, being a manufacturer, producer, a processor, or of any merchandise or object of commerce, or an importer of any merchandise or object of commerce from any foreign country, either as principal or agent, wholesaler or retailer, shall combine, conspire, or agree in any manner with any person likewise engaged in the manufacture, production, processing, assembling, or importation of such merchandise or object of commerce, or with any other persons not so similarly engaged for the purpose of making transactions prejudicial to a lawful commerce or of increasing the market price in any part of the Philippines of any such merchandise or object of commerce, manufactured, produced, processed, assembled in, or imported into the Philippines, or of any article in the manufacture of which such manufactured, produced, or imported merchandise or object of commerce is used. If the offense mentioned in this article affects any food substance, motor fuel or lubricants or other articles of prime necessity, the penalty shall be that of prison mayor in its maximum and medium periods, it being sufficient for the imposition thereof that the initial steps have been taken toward carrying out the purposes of the combination. Any property possessed under any contract or by any combination mentioned in the preceding paragraphs are being the subject thereof shall be forfeited to the government of the Philippines. Whenever any of the offenses described above is committed by a corporation or association, the president and each one of its agents or representatives in the Philippines, in case of a foreign corporation or association, who shall have knowingly permitted or failed to prevent the commission of such offense, shall be held liable as principals thereof. Section 22. Frauds in Commerce and Industry. Article 187. Importation and disposition of falsely marked articles or merchandise made of gold, silver, or other precious metals or their alloys. The penalty of prison correctional or a fine ranging from 40,000 to 200,000 or both shall be imposed upon any person who shall knowingly import or sell or dispose of any article or merchandise made of gold, silver, or other precious metals, or their alloys with stamps, brands, or marks which fail to indicate the actual fineness or quality of said metals or alloys. Any stamp, brand, label, or mark shall be deemed to fail to indicate the actual fineness of the article on which it is engraved, printed, stamped, labeled, or attached, when the test of the article shows that the quality of or fineness thereof is less by more than 1/2 carat, if made of gold, and less by more than 4/1000 if made of silver, than what is shown by said stamp, brand, label, or mark. But in case of watch cases and flatware made of gold, the actual fineness of such gold shall not be less than more than 3/1000 than the fineness indicated by said stamp, brand, label, or mark.